Okay, so this is part 4 of our Gameology series. Be sure you check out parts 1, 2, and 3 before checking this one out. Okay, so in our last installment of Gameology, we talked about how density in an open world game can be achieved basically through fundamental game design. You know, level design, the abilities of the playable character, enemy placement, stuff like that. But as we were talking about that, I alluded to another method that developers use in order to achieve density in an open world game, and how it's one that is unfortunately becoming a recurrent problem with open world games moving forward. And that is what I call checklist design. So, what is checklist design? Well, you guys probably know it better as Ubisoft design. Which is a term I try to avoid using because it's not something that's exclusive to Ubisoft games anymore. It got that moniker because the first game that many people point to that suffer from checklist syndrome is Ubisoft's Far Cry 3. So what do I mean by checklist syndrome? Well, basically, if a game suffers from checklist syndrome, that means that rather than relying on what I talked about in the last video on how to achieve density in an open world, it instead tries to do so through a myriad of side missions. Now, that on its own isn't a bad idea. In fact, there are a lot of open world games that are very successful with doing that. Yakuza, for example, that game, a good bulk of the game comes from the side content. But whereas in Yakuza, they have a lot of different activities for you to be doing, and a lot of them they can find you going down a bunch of different rabbit holes, almost secondary storylines in a sense. That is not checklist design. That is actually, using side content properly in an open world game. But checklist design instead refers to when, rather than having a variety of side tasks to do, they just have like maybe 3, 4, maybe 5 tasks that they just repeat across the entire game. And this is something that unfortunately has become very popular with a lot of modern open world games. I understand why too, because it is a very easy way to add content to an open world game. But at the same time, people are just starting to get tired of it. And myself included, because a lot of the time it just turns these open world games into a tedious mess. A good example of that would actually be the Mad Max game, which has to be the most grind-happy video game I have ever played in my entire life, even more so than some RPGs I've played. So, when I talk about density through, fundamental game design, I'm typically referring to the main missions of a game. And all the best open world games I've played, the bulk of the content is the main story missions. Red Dead Redemption, Infamous, Grand Theft Auto. These are the ones I think of when I think of good open world design. But with Mad Max, it barely has any story lead missions. I think overall you count the amount of story missions in the game on one hand. On two hands, I mean. Everything else of the game, you're just doing the same thing over and over again. You're storming camps, which usually means just beating the crap out of war boys, or blowing up fuel transfer tanks, running down convoys, which you just use the same tactics over and over again, looting scrap to upgrade the Magnum Opus. That's tedious as all hell. Mad Max just gets so boring, so tedious, and so frustrating very early on. And that is not uncommon for a lot of open world games these days. And this is why I refer to it as checklist syndrome, because rather than, getting immersed in the world, getting into the story, taking on all the side content, all that fun stuff, you're instead just, crossing stuff off a checklist. Now, you can do it at your own pace, which is nice, but it's still dull as hell. And nothing kills an open world game for me more than this kind of game design. I remember when I played Pokemon Arceus when it came out, or Pokemon Legends Arceus, whatever the hell you want to call it. And I was really excited at the prospect of getting to play an open world Pokemon game. But then I got a screen telling me that I wasn't allowed to progress until I captured a certain amount of Pokemon or crossed a certain amount of objectives on my list. And I realized that rather than this being the big, epic, open world Pokemon game that I wanted, it was instead just a great big scavenger hunt. That's all it really was at the end of the day. It wouldn't be until Pokemon Violet and Pokemon Scarlet that they would actually do an open world game properly. All that being said, having checklist design in a open world game isn't necessarily a bad thing. Now, take Spider-Man for example. Spider-Man does use checklist design. A lot of the side content in this game, it is just repeated throughout the entire map. You know, taking photographs of all the environments, the Black Cat locations, the, fish sites, all that stuff. Yeah, you are kind of doing the Far Cry stuff in that game. However, the reason it's not a problem in Spider-Man is for two reasons. One, none of that is required in this game. For something like Mad Max, you have to do a lot of the side content because you need to beef the Magnum Opus's stats up to a certain degree and make sure Max is tough enough to survive. It's really hard to get by with just the basic abilities of the Magnum Opus, as well as just, a shotgun that only fires one shot. In Pokemon Arceus, a lot of stuff you need to do for the checklist, it's required in order to progress. None of that is required in Spider-Man. And the other reason that it's not a problem in Spider-Man is because it's actually a lot of fun to be out in the open world as Spider-Man. And that leads us into the next topic I want to talk about. And that, to me, is just creating the joy of beating out in an open world. Tune in next time, and I'll tell you guys all about that.